Good afternoon. I am Sarah May Stern, the chair of Hudson Institute. It is my honor to introduce the speakers for today's conversation about James Baker III. Peter Baker is the White House correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC, as well as a prolific author. Welcome, Peter. Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker, the author of its weekly Letter from Trump's Washington, and a global affairs analyst for CNN. Glad to have you here. You may not know that these two accomplished co-authors are also married. Today's discussion of their new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, will be moderated by Hudson's very own Walter Russell Mead, the Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow here at Hudson. I look forward to listening to your discussion. All yours, Walter.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the introduction. And really, thank you, Susan and Peter, for joining us for this. You've written a terrific book, I must say. Here it is. And everybody who's watching really needs to buy not just one copy for yourself, but one to give to a friend, and then one to keep in storage because just in case something might happen to the other two. So that would be my recommendation here.
Well, thank you, Walter. We did not pay him, I should note, for that advertisement.
But we wholly agree.
But we appreciate it.
All right. I couldn't help comparing this book a little bit with the George Packer life of Richard Holbrooke, which I've heard a lot of friends describe as, a definitive book about the American century and the American foreign policy establishment, all this. But reading your book, and I knew and liked Richard, it struck me maybe Baker is more sort of a definitive figure in the American century.
Well, I think that those two are really interesting books to read as a pair, in the sense that Holbrooke obviously was a sort of a pillar and saw himself very much as a pillar of the Democratic foreign policy establishment. And, in a similar period to Jim Baker, who was a pivotal figure, not just in foreign policy, but in American politics over the entire time period from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War. So in a sense, they represent two sides of Washington in that period of time.
Yeah, I think in some ways Baker had the career Holbrooke wanted.
Yeah, I think right.
I think so.
Yeah, I think Holbrooke, of course, was his dashed ambition to be Secretary of State is at the heart of George's book to some extent. The desperate desire to finally prove himself, and that animated James Baker too. I think he said that Baker actually got there, and there was this desire on Baker's part, which I think is one of the themes of our book, to transcend being a fixer, transcend being an operative, to become a principal, a person actually at the table.
And I guess he was never quite happy that he didn't make it to president.
Well, that's right. I think his story actually is a story of both incredible accomplishment, but also in the end, not fully satisfied ambition. And I think he had enough self-awareness to realize that electoral politics with him in the front was not necessarily his strong suit. He actually ran for office just once in 1978 and was not a good candidate, to say the least. A great description in the book of him going around to county fairs in Texas and not knowing what to do with himself, and certainly not kissing babies. But ironically, had he won that one race for Texas Attorney General, he never would have had the career that he ended up having, and he certainly would not have become Secretary of State.
It'd be interesting to think of him as a career Texas politician. It's funny how also when you talk about this, there have been so many major politicians coming out of Texas in the sort of second half of the 20th century. Lyndon Johnson to George W. Bush. It's almost the definitive state.
Well, it is. One of the very authentic Texans was William Baker, not only born there, but really part of the Texas aristocracy going back for generations. He was called James A. Baker III, but he was really the fourth James Addison Baker. And we never figured out, by the way, why. We spent 7 years on this book. One mystery we never solved, why he's the third, if he's really the fourth. The family says they don't do math very well. But in any case, the point is that his family, the Baker family, was so pivotal to the rise of modern Houston, really authentically Texan through and through, much more than his friend George H.W. Bush, of course, who was a transplant from Connecticut. And I think you're right. I mean, there's something very Texas about him. But Baker also was a kind of a, he was the kind of person who could adapt himself to different circumstances. He could be a Texan through and through in Houston, but he also went to Princeton and he could talk, with East Coast elites in their language as well. He wore, monogram shirts, and one of his aides told us about, going on the Hill to meet with Jesse Helms, the cantankerous Republican senator from North Carolina, and chatting about duck hunting, and then going next door to meet with Chris Dodd, the sort of erudite Northeasterner, and talk about opera, and both of these things I think were authentic to Baker.
Right. I reading those sections of the book, I thought, both Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson would have given everything they had to be able to do exactly that.
Right.
That's right. And I do think that there was a kind of self-confidence that came with that unique background that Baker had. He had been grown up in great privilege, although the kind of duty and constraints that came along with it definitely shaped him in terms of discipline and work ethic and things like that. But, really it's a kind of self-confidence that we encountered actually even in the many interviews we did with him for the book well into his 80s. He had an ability to meet people where they are, and the sort of volcanic insecurity that you read about when it comes to LBJ or Richard Nixon is just not a factor in Baker's personality. And I think it was one of the keys to his success.
He was able to use all of his energy to paying attention to other people rather than sort of wrestling with his own demons, it sometimes seems.
Yeah, although I would make one point, which is that he certainly, to the extent he is prickly about anything, it's a defensiveness about his own, I think, well-deserved reputation for protecting his reputation and, sort of growing it. And he was known from the Reagan era on as a very, very skilled practitioner of the art of, sort of care and feeding the media and looking after his own interests, finding a way to be miles from a terrible problem and not having any ownership of it, most famously Iran-Contra, I guess, while at the same time somehow miraculously being in the center of all the things that went right. And so I would say that, he clearly cared an awful lot about his reputation, and we saw that as well in our interactions with him.
I remember this during the Reagan administration. Everywhere Baker went, there was this kind of zone of quiet in the administration that was sort of erupting and clashing, and the press was going crazy and everybody was screaming. And then there was this little quiet area around James Baker. And when he moved from place to place, the cloud of quiet went with it. How did he do that?
I think, you're right about that. I think that his presence was, as part of his skill set, right? That he did walk into the room and you did feel like, okay, here's a grown up here. Here's somebody who's exceedingly competent. Here's somebody who's going to make crisp decisions. He will listen, but not, dwell on something. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was impressive, for instance, to Nancy Reagan, which is one of the reasons he was successful in that White House. Nancy Reagan saw him. Here's somebody who looked the part. Here's somebody who acted the part. He was dignified. He dressed like a GQ, kind of Republican. And that carried him a long way, I think, toward, controlling any room that he was in.
Yeah, the bond between him and Nancy Reagan really was interesting, especially because it's pretty clear from what you're saying, he was like the number one leaker in the White House a lot of the time. And she was the kind of person who didn't like that sort of behavior.
Well, I think partially it was, he managed to at least portray the idea that it was in service of Reagan's agenda, that it was a necessary skill, one of the great dark arts of Washington, and that he was good at it. I also think that he went out of his way to understand what a power she was in Reagan's world. And as an outsider, this was crucial for him to come in as having run not one, but two national campaigns against Ronald Reagan. It's actually quite extraordinary that Reagan would have offered the job to Baker in the first place. And so, in a way, maybe he had to be a conscious student of how power worked in Reagan's world. And I think he just was very he was ruthless and disciplined in that as in all other things. Remember, his relationships were pretty transactional. I mean,
Yeah.
that was a takeaway that we had.
Mm.
He worked for years with some people like Bob Zoellick, who then went on to become the head of the World Bank, one of Baker's closest advisors over this entire period. Zoellick told us that, Baker, he didn't knew his wife's name. He didn't invite these people over to dinner at his house. It was not, he made it clear that it was not a personal bond, but a professional one. And I think he was a cold fish in that sense.
Reagan was a cold fish too, sort of in that way, though Reagan was a little better at sort of covering it with the appearance of caring. But that, I wondered if that was part of the reason they were able to, and it's just they both were very cold and self-contained to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there was that connection, right? Because in fact, obviously ideologically within the party, they were not alike. Baker was not a Reaganite, at least in the beginning. He, like a lot of Republicans, was afraid of Reagan, thought he was, brought into the concern of being a warmonger or, an actor from Bedtime for Bonzo. But I think they did bond. And I think they did bond because they had a few shared personality traits. They both, as you say, were self-contained and self-confident without needing other people's approval in the same way. I think that they shared a sort of ribald sense of humor. I think they shared a love of the outdoors. Reagan obviously loved horseback riding. Baker loved hunting and fishing. I think that was a shared trait for them. And I think actually Reagan was more of a pragmatist than people often like to think. And I think he appreciated that Baker could translate the vision that he expressed into, actual accomplishments rather than getting hooked up on, waiting for 100% of what you might want.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the things you guys brought out really clearly, is the degree to which, while a lot of the ideologues around Reagan were furious at Baker the whole time, the support Baker had from Reagan was just unstinting and constant. That was the side I hadn't seen of him before.
Well, look, right, this sort of let Reagan be Reagan idea, which dogged Baker throughout Reagan's presidency, was really a dig at Baker, but it also was sort of an insult to Reagan. In a way, some of their shots at Baker were because they couldn't openly take shots at Reagan. And actually, that's something that Richard Viguerie said and acknowledged to us. And I think that, there were both sides, obviously, of Reagan, the ideologue and the pragmatist who wanted to succeed, or certainly saw that political success at that moment in time required you to do something. Otherwise you were just a guy talking. And I think that is the biggest difference, of course, between then and now. And one of our goals in writing the book certainly was to consider how Washington has changed. And I think the structural differences between Reagan's Washington, Bush's Washington, and this incredibly dysfunctional world that we're living in today. Clearly, one of the major differences is not that it was so much less partisan, and obviously it was a very partisan time. It's not that our politics were, kumbaya, and it's not that Reagan wasn't ideological. The difference, it seems to me, and one that Peter and I found so illuminating to be working on this book while also living and working real time in the Washington of today, it was that Baker understood and channeled this for Reagan, that if you wanted to win re-election in 1984, you had to do something. You had to deliver on your promises, that the road to political success ran through governing. And obviously, that's no longer the case in a way, much to our detriment. As we're sitting here, I think it's been since April that Congress and the president have failed to deliver a coronavirus relief package for the American people, despite being, at least by their own statements, in a multi-trillion-dollar package, only a few $100 million away from each other, and yet couldn't close the gap because they didn't want to. And they fundamentally didn't think that they needed to go to the election and show the American people that they had done something.
I wonder if you look at the voters actually ended up punishing both parties, which is, actually took a certain dexterity to do. But Trump lost the presidential election, and the House and the Senate disappointed the Democrats. I wonder, if Trump had a Baker or could keep a Baker, would we be settling in for the second Trump administration?
I think he could. Yeah, yeah. I think the second part of your question is the way to put it. Could he have had a Baker? Yeah, maybe. Could he have kept a Baker or empowered a Baker or made it possible for a Baker to be successful? No, because clearly, I think what Trump has shown us is that that's just not his nature. He believes he's his own chief of staff, he's his own political strategist, his own communications director, and everybody who served as his chief of staff has come away disappointed, frustrated, and I think that, we see that that's not what Baker got. What Baker got with Reagan was that empowerment to be Reagan's guy. Reagan had his back, and that was something that Trump has never shown his chiefs of staff.
Yeah, and that actually, I remember at the time, people criticized Reagan continuously for being a disengaged president. But actually reading your book, I'm thinking, well, that may have been part of his success, that he was able to, get a direction and stand back and let Baker take it.
In my view, Walter, actually, this is one of the reasons that Reagan experience is one of the reasons that Baker himself and perhaps other Republicans misjudged Trump initially and thought that there was, in fact, the possibility of a sort of adults in the room scenario. The idea that you would take someone with, some instincts and big slogans and possibly be able to turn those into a governing agenda, turn that into a more recognizable form of American government. And what that missed, of course, was looking at Trump's background and history as a businessman. By the way, his conduct, if you talk to people or read any of the books that were written about Trump as the Trump organization, you would have known full well that he couldn't possibly have a professional White House chief of staff because this is how he's operated his entire life. I think those who took a more psychological analysis of Trump or actually looked at his biography would have understand why that wasn't going to work. But I think a lot of Republicans and probably some Democrats too thought that there was a more realistic chance for the kind of grown-ups to prevail than there actually turned out to be.
Well, one thing that may be related to this is it comes through very strongly in here that, for the Bushes and I think for some other folks, there's this idea that politics, the process of getting elected, is this disagreeable clown show that you have to put on in order so that the silly voters will let you get back in there where you do what they need for you to do, but don't necessarily know that themselves. And so there's a built-in sense that, yes, of course, somebody running for office is going to behave in a kind of a clownish, demagogic way. And that may have contributed to the thinking that, okay, Trump is just, this is the Trump show. But of course, like anybody else, once the votes come in, we get down to business.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think you're right. Bush and Baker saw campaigning as a necessary evil. It was an ugly thing you had to do. If you had to make some compromises to the kind of person you'd like to be, you did it because you had to win. They're very competitive guys, both these two, Bush and Baker. But you're right. Once it was over, it was over. It was supposed to be over. And then you were supposed to be the grown-up, the mature adult who would lead the country. And you're right. There was, I think, a parallel there. I remember Donald Trump came to the New York Times after his election for a meeting with the editorial board and the publisher and all that. And he basically said, "It's going to be okay. Look, you're going to find out that I did what I had." In effect, what he was saying, I did what I had to do to get elected, but I'm going to be a responsible actor in office. Of course, it turned out that what we saw in the campaign trail is what we saw in office as well. It was the difference. And Reagan, the difference with Reagan, where the comparison falls with Reagan, among other things, is that Reagan actually had been a politician. He'd been governor of the largest state for 8 years. He wasn't just an entertainer coming in who was performing a show. He actually did have experience in governing. He knew that in a democratic Sacramento, you couldn't simply just, give your speeches and call it a day. You had to do something. And so he had an experience level that Trump didn't have coming in.
Well, he also had a view of this as a means to an end. He had some ends that he cared about. He wasn't just a narcissist. I mean, the goal was not just himself, that's pretty obvious.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think in some ways you've written the book as a kind of a history of the Republican Party of the last 30 years. And, the shift from the Reagan era to between the first and second Bush. And then at the end, the book, like everything else in America, is dominated by Donald Trump, the closing pages. How would you describe that trajectory?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's such a different Republican Party now, right? And this is what Baker agonized over as we talked to him. Now, we began this book back in 2013 before Trump was really on the radar screen, and it was always going to be about Washington as much as it was about Baker and how Washington changed and how the Republican Party had changed even at that point. But after Trump, does rise and capture the nomination and the presidency, these conversations we had with Baker were really very revealing, both about him and I think about the old version of the Republican establishment. They were struggling. He was struggling to make sense of this, right? And he did, I think, entertain the idea that, well, maybe this will be like Reagan. Then he entertained the idea that he could be helped along by recommending his friend Rex Tillerson, for instance, as Secretary of State. He'll listen to Rex, it'll be okay. That obviously didn't happen. And he does not fool himself about Trump. He thinks, Baker, that is, told us he thinks he's nuts. That's his word, not mine. He thinks he's crazy. That's his word, not mine. And yet he couldn't quite bring himself to break with him either. And I think that even though the Republican Party under Trump is not like the Republican Party under Baker on trade, on immigration, on fiscal discipline, on alliances and internationalism and leadership in the world. And despite all that, Baker says he can't quite break himself away from the new Republican Party. At one point, he told us, yeah, I think I might be able to vote for Biden, because the truth is Biden is his kind of Democrat, a deal maker, a institutionalist. And then 2 months later, he says, don't say I'm going to vote for Biden. I'm a Republican. I'm going to stick with my party, even though my party has left me. And I think that's how he views it. His party has left him.
Well, I think people sometimes don't pay enough attention to Southern political history, that after Reconstruction, there were basically two parties inside the White South, a sort of business-oriented, progressive, New South kind of party, and then a populist, raging party. And the sort of the elite, the New South folks are saying things like, well, let's put all this race stuff in the background. We need to attract Northern investment and so on and so forth. And the populists are, what? You want to help the Northern banks come down here? Are you crazy? Et cetera. And so I think that helps me understand some of the bitterness in modern Republican politics since the White South more or less moved en masse into the Republican Party. But I think it may also explain why people like Baker are sort of a little bit more tolerant. Okay, they're used to sometimes the populists take over, but you're still a Democrat. That at least was the old world. At least that's my humble reading.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think that a lot of it is also just Baker being fundamentally a small c conservative, an institutionalist. He's the opposite of revolutionary, even though he's navigated through several revolutionary times, both within the Republican Party and also in the end of the Cold War, which was a formative experience, obviously, and understanding, what did he and Bush bring to the table. It wasn't, in Baker's case, being steeped in international relations theory or even nuclear throwaways, right? What Baker brought to being Secretary of State when the world changed, when the Cold War ended, was a fundamental instinct for stability and for engagement, combined with just a real horse sense for understanding who he was dealing with and the needs of politics, whether it was domestic politics and the person across the table was a congressman, or international politics and the person across the table was Mikhail Gorbachev. And right. So it seems to me that when you're talking about this question of what kind of Republican was he, is it his fault that Republicans have ended up the way they are today? Is it he's just riding with the times? What I would say are a couple things. One, he learned, he's been through several revolutionary pivots in politics. Remember, he grew up as a Southern Democrat, as everybody was around him. He switched to become a Republican. Then he saw Republican Party transform. He was a country club establishment Republican. He and Bush were on the losing side. They won when it came to themselves and their own careers, but they lost on essentially the ideological argument inside their party. The difference is in the final act, George H.W. Bush said, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. And Baker decided to make one last pivot.
Right. Well, of course, George H.W. Bush had a little bit more skin in the game, and that Trump had defeated his son, Jeb.
what's remarkable is that Baker could have used that excuse too. There's no one, who is more intertwined with George Bush than Jim Baker. Their stories are connected. They can't be severed. Neither, I think, would have reached the heights that he did reach without the other. And he had every easy excuse in the world in his late 80s to say, this is too much for me. I am always a Bush, and no. That would have been literally an easy out for this guy. And the fact that he didn't take it, for us as his biographers, we kept asking him the same question over and over again. But when somebody gives you the same answer over and over again, you have to listen to them. What is he trying to tell us?
Right. One thing that I found interesting in the book is the degree to which religion was important to him.
Mhm.
And, both I found that interesting because you can read a lot of American biographies these days and never hear anybody talk about it one way or the other. But also that it does seem to have been a long-term theme in his life. I wondered, for one thing, how did you find that out? Did he bring it up? Did other people tell you? How did that subject come up?
He doesn't bring it up. You're right about that. I think he's one of these interesting people who understands that or believes that religion is private and not something that you bring it up in conversation. Just generally because I think he has the sensibility that it makes some people nervous or uncomfortable if they don't happen to share the same views. But his wife, Susan Baker, in particular, I think had a powerful influence on him, and I think probably made him more religious than he had been before. He likes to joke that the first sound he hears in the morning are the thump thump when Mrs. Baker's knees hit the floor in the morning for her morning prayer. And he kept the Runner's Bible, and he would always, very well thumbed Runner's Bible he would flip through every day. So I think it did matter to him, but he also didn't believe in religiosity in the public sphere in the same way. He was not a culture warrior. It wasn't the kind of thing that he made part of his career. So for him, it's private.
Well, yeah. And it's not really made in the book, but I think it tells you something about what is the essence of the man. He's a deal maker at heart, and not the kind who brags about it, but just naturally, that's his natural, that's his comfort zone. That's the thing that he reverts to, that he knows he's good at, and then he relishes doing. And even late in life, this is what he's continued to do, whether it was cutting the deal to finally get the dispute between the Eisenhower family and the makers of this recent memorial that finally was unveiled. But in Texas, the Episcopal Church was embroiled in a big fight over same-sex marriage, and actually every single one of the southern state Episcopal churches ended up seceding from the national church over this a few years ago, except in Texas, where the local head of the church approached Baker, asked him to help figure out a solution. Baker is so proud that he negotiated this deal, and it was just like one of his Secretary of State deals, where he basically said, okay, well, we're going to accept this in Texas, but we're just going to have a little bit longer to get used to it and to have it fully come into effect. And Texas was the only southern state that did not secede from the National Episcopal Church. To me, that tells you both about his religion and also about his natural, just at the end of life, as he was in the beginning, a deal maker just by natural ability and temperament.
The place of natural deal making was both, in a sense, at its best and at its worst, may have been at the end of the Cold War, when, as I think you do a very good job of showing, how he worked on the unification of Germany and sort of the peaceful end of this enormous conflict. But at the same time, you raise some interesting questions about the vision thing. And, did actually decisions that were taken then, maybe not even really seriously considered then, did, not helping Russia very much, or, some others, did that really help contribute to where we are today with Russia?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one that's hard to answer, but one that is necessary to ask and debate. Because I think that, you're right. I mean, Baker was not a revolutionary. He didn't make the Berlin Wall fall. He didn't make the Soviet Union fall. But he took these forces of history that were at play at that particular moment, and he harnessed them toward a safe landing, in effect. And that's not an inevitable. History looks inevitable in hindsight, but it was not inevitable that this empire would collapse without a huge volcanic combustion of violence. And so I think Baker and Bush get some credit for having brought us to a safe landing, a place where we could move forward. But you're right. I mean, Russia today is obviously not the Russia we had hoped it would be in 1991. And how much was that because we Americans didn't do enough at that time? We explored that with him, of course. They did talk about the idea of a Marshall Plan, but he says, look, the politics weren't there for it. The domestic audience wasn't interested in spending lots of money on what would be in effect a defeated rival when we had all these problems at home, the recession and a desire to use this peace dividend for American priorities. Now, did they fight hard enough for it? Probably not. Could they have actually pushed that through? Maybe. It would have helped if they had a second term. They didn't win the second term.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. And Baker himself says, look, maybe we made a mistake. We Americans made a mistake by pushing too hard on NATO expansion. I'm not sure whether there's a lot of debate about that. A lot of people wouldn't agree with that. But he himself has tried to explore where did things go wrong? Because obviously in 1991, things look really pretty good.
Yeah. Now, I think that is interesting. If they'd had a second term, what would they have done? But it does seem to me that with German unification, you had a great, you had a real opportunity to provide a Marshall Plan for Russia with German money.
Yeah.
That sort of orchestrating some kind of a deal there could have been, and so the Americans wouldn't have been alone forking it out. But that's, you're right. If we had had a bad deal maker there, things would have been bad. But I somehow think that remains a missed opportunity.
Well, it's very interesting, Walter, because I think, he titled his memoir of his time at the State Department, The Politics of Diplomacy. And, really one of the big things that he brought to this was probably the best possible understanding of the politics of foreign policy in Washington and on Capitol Hill. He understood how Congress worked. Remember, he was coming out of having been Treasury Secretary and getting that 1986 tax reform bill passed with Democratic House and Republicans in the Senate. It was a major accomplishment. So this was the frame by which he ran foreign policy at the end of the Cold War, was an acute understanding of what the load would bear, basically, here in Washington. And I think the other factor, I would say, was not just a matter of money and the peace dividend, quote unquote, which was that was the conversation at the time, right? So sometimes the frame around it influences what you can do, and everybody saw it as like sort of war's over, let's get the money back. And the other frame there weren't just hardliners in the Soviet Union circling around Gorbachev and waiting to pick him apart, which of course happened not that long afterwards. And, that's the other amazing what might have been, right? Had the Berlin Wall fallen a little later, had Gorbachev's position already weakened more internally, that deal never would have gotten done. But there were also hardliners here back in Washington, and the Republican Party at the Pentagon. They were pressuring enormously. And Baker's instinct for deal making there, I think, and the sort of inevitability of a kind of split the difference approach. If you are a deal maker, the truth of the matter was that he and Bush were not inclined by inclination or temperament to be visionaries about creating the world anew after the Cold War. They also didn't have the political ability within their own party. They were constantly on the defensive with conservatives in Washington. Both of them were still seen as outsiders, and there really was no possible way for them to entirely dismiss to anyone's satisfaction the concerns of hardliners within the national security establishment that Russia wouldn't one day come back and be a threat, and we had to be on guard for that, which of course, was that a self-fulfilling prophecy that ended us exactly in that place, or were they being prescient and pragmatic?
Right. Well, I think there's sort of a Reagan, if this had all happened, if Reagan had had a third term and had, been as engaged as he had been, Reagan had the ability to change the political calculus in the United States. That's something H.W. Bush, he was, he worked within the political parameters that existed. He couldn't move, he couldn't shift the discussion.
That's right.
So, so I I think another president might have been able to make more happen, but that was just not the Bush thing.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a very smart analysis exactly about Bush and Baker. They took what was in front of them and they made the most of the opportunities they saw in front of them. They didn't make the opportunities.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and interesting. Well, Baker, it's interesting going forward. Baker never aligned, he never sort of bought in with either the neoconservatives or the Trumpian populists.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sort of two movements, big movements in Republican Party politics since Bush 41 were just not, he just was not part of. How would you characterize his foreign policy views in contrast to Bull's?
Well, first of all, of course, he obviously was very skeptical of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That was not something he thought was a good idea. He's not really, he's an internationalist and believes in American leadership and an assertive American leadership on the international stage, but he does not believe in use of military force except when generally necessary. Even during the buildup to the first Gulf War, he was on the more skeptical side, and it was George Bush who was being more forward-leaning on that. And of course, Baker got on board with it. It was his friend, and he didn't disagree with it, but he was more cautious about it. And we during our interviews with him, one of the things we heard again and again from him was his just exhaustion with the wars of the last 20 years. I remember we were in his ranch in Wyoming at one point, and he just kind of says, and he kind of has this exasperated tones, was no more wars, no more wars. And he was just pained, I think, at what had happened in the last 20 years. So you're right. He didn't believe in the freedom agenda, George W. Bush view of the world where we would try to change the world for democracy. He was very much a see the world as it is, do what you can to lock in the best benefits for America. There's this great anecdote, which don't have in the book actually, which we learned after. It's from Jim Mann, who was the LA Times reporter at the time, now a scholar. And when he was on the plane with him coming back, I think from Moscow, and he asked Baker about this criticism that you're sticking with Gorbachev for too long. He said, look, I'm sticking with Gorbachev because I'm getting really good deals right now. I got a good deal on Angola. I got a good deal on Cambodia. I'm going to get a good deal on nuclear arms. And if I don't get any good deals, I'll move on. And that was just, that was Baker's view of international relationships. Get the deals you can get that are in front of you, and rather than try to change the world.
Well, and I would say, Walter, though, in addition to that, his deep-seated skepticism about military power and when it's useful, what makes him different from these sort of new isolationists is I've never also met someone who had those views, but had such a true belief in internationalism and diplomacy and allies. And that is those things are twin for Baker in a way that I think you probably have to go very far back, to the Truman era, perhaps, to really see somebody in the immediate aftermath of the World II who would have both of those views at the same time. Baker's is as close to a natural diplomat for that reason as almost anyone I've seen, because he actually really, really believes that American leadership can't be sitting here at home. But at the same time, it's not a sort of guns bristling version at all. And I came away thinking that there's very, very, very few circumstances where left to his own devices, he would think that it was in the national interest to use military force.
Another way, obviously, in which he's very different from a lot of the Republican consensus now, there's a certain skepticism about the value of the Israeli alliance. Maybe I'm putting that a little too strongly, but he certainly had his run-ins and seems to sort of represent a kind of a continuation of that earlier Republican tradition of being kind of more interested in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf than in Israel, and seeing Israel or a liability to be managed than an asset to be enjoyed. Is that right, or am I missing something here?
No, I think that's basically right. Bush and Baker were the last of the Republican leadership before the party really changed into a much more full-throated, Israel is our friend and our ally above all others approach. His son George W. Bush is much more obviously overtly pro-Israel in his approach to the Middle East. That part of that might be driven from the fact that Bush and Baker were, from Texas and had more of an oil view of the world, and the Arab states were obviously there for part of their thinking. I think also Bush got off to a bad start with Shamir, the Israeli prime minister at the time. He felt like Shamir had not been straight with him about the settlements. That soured things in the beginning. Baker, I think, was also soured by what he thought was his Israeli intransigence on the settlements. He felt better about the next government that came along, the Labor government, that he felt he could work with more closely. But you're right, they had the kind of disputes with Israel at that time that you would never see today from a Republican administration. They literally cut off the loan guarantees for a while and had open fights. And it's unthinkable in today's Republican Party. In fact, when Jim Baker went to speak to J Street in 2015, and they only got Jeb Bush in trouble because Jim Baker was seen as an advisor to Jeb Bush, and therefore, how could you have an advisor here go to see J Street when they're so clearly not pro-Israel enough?
Yeah, I mean, that's a reflection of how much the Republican Party has changed domestically. The power of the evangelical Christians to sort of dictate a foreign policy agenda has been happening over the last couple decades. And so in many ways, I don't think it reflects a permanent geopolitical vision of the world on the part of Baker and Bush as much as it reflected the political realities of the Republican Party at that time.
Okay, yeah. And it is certainly true that we needed that Middle East oil a lot more in the 90s than we do now.
Yes. Yeah, and we rely today on Israel as a real partner in counterterrorism in a way that
Right.
became really important after 9/11.
Yeah, so things have changed, presumably, if he would reflect the realities one suspects. Let's see. What can we learn from the book? This is probably a terrible question to ask, but what is the lessons that the book has for American foreign policy today?
Where we go?
Well, look, one thing we're about to see a kick back in. We'll see where, how far you can take it. But Jim Baker was a huge, as I said, believer in diplomacy for its own sake and in allies and partners, and that you don't get anything done in the world unless you have allies and partners. And we've just spent the last 4 years, dumping on those allies. And you're about to see some Baker level diplomacy in action here. And that is something that was always kind of mystifying to me about the last few years, in the sense that needlessly antagonizing those with whom you have common cause. On China, that was probably the number one thing I heard, and I'm sure you heard as well from people in Europe, was, hey, listen, we're your best partners here. Why wouldn't we make common cause if you want to reorient policy toward China, if you want to have this new and understandable skepticism about the previous policy of incorporating China into global institutions, why not work with Europe on that? And instead, we chose at times to characterize our European partners as bigger problems and allies, even foes, than we did with the dictatorships of the world. Baker, to him, that was mystifying. And he never understood that aspect of the Trump era. And I do think that, you go back and you read about that diplomacy in the months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the dealings with the Soviets. Every single time he would go to Moscow, he would immediately fly to Germany and to Brussels and to London and consult intensively. And then he would go back on the other side, and he would do it on the front end before he went back to Moscow, and he would sit with them as well. And that works. That's effective. And wouldn't it be nice to be effective?
So more coordination with allies. It also does seem to me that Germany was really central to his vision of allies. There was no, Britain is nice, France is our friend, but Germany is the center of our vision. And of course, he overruled, in a sense, both he and Bush overruled the skepticism in London and Paris about German unification.
Yeah, as a case study of diplomacy, it's a remarkable story, because in fact, it's not just that you had to negotiate with the Soviets, who had 300,000 troops still in East Germany at that time. Getting them to voluntarily move those out by itself would be an enormous challenge. Then you had to negotiate, as you point out rightly, with Margaret Thatcher, who in Britain didn't like the idea of a reunified Germany. She said, I think we like Germany so much, we think there should be two of them. And same with Francois Mitterrand in France. And you can understand, of course, Britain and France having fought 2 wars against Germany, why they would be nervous about this. And then, of course, there were the Germans themselves. You not only had to negotiate between the East and the West, you had to negotiate within West Germany itself, where you had a chancellor, Helmut Kohl, from one party, and a foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, from another party, who sometimes were not exactly on the same wavelength. And so to be able to pull all those things together, to deal with all those different dynamics and do it in a relatively short amount of time, really a matter of months, I think is a case study in successful diplomacy. As Susan points out, had it dragged on even a little bit longer, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait might have upended, that ability to happen. The coup in Moscow might have made it impossible to bring that together. And so he took advantage of that moment and made it happen within the time frame he had available to him.
That's one of the things that it's often makes it difficult to understand history, is we get focused on one story, like the Kuwait story, and we forget what was happening in Moscow at the time and how these would have all intersected in the decision makers. And that's even true for those of us who lived through it.
Right.
Yeah, but this actually made me rethink the way one looks at history generally, that to the policymaker, you're in the middle of a storm.
Yes.
At moments like that.
Well, and in fact, actually, Walter, this invasion of Kuwait and the unraveling of the Soviet Empire, they were not only experienced simultaneously by Baker, but actually, I think we've lost the context because of everything that's happened since in the Middle East and, with the subsequent invasion of Iraq. I think we've actually lost the context in which he saw it and experienced it as a diplomat, which was very much as the first major test of what he already saw as the post-Cold War era. And I lived through it at the time as well, and yet had completely sort of forgotten or lost this interpretation of it. And I think doing the book, I realized once again, for Baker, for the State Department, for Bush, this was not so much about, moving pieces on the chessboard of the Middle East, as it was absolutely how can we figure out a way to show the world that the old binary with us or against us politics of the Cold War, which had played out not only in the Middle East, but everywhere around the world, were over. And actually, that's where, Baker's famous statement flying to Moscow and appearing jointly with Edward Shevardnadze to denounce the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This was really, for Baker, I think, and for understanding what was actually happening then, this was the signature moment.
Yep. And there was also, here was the UN working the way it was designed to work.
Right.
In a way that, was exhilarating at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Why didn't it work? Why didn't it last?
It's a good question. I mean, part of it, of course, the UN as a structure is just filled with bureaucracy and inertia and resistance to decisive action. The Russians were on our side at that particular moment, but didn't stay there. The Chinese have obviously been allergic to, the idea that the UN could tell anybody else what to do because it might be turned against them in that way. So, it was this moment, you're right, where the UN actually was of great use to the United States and of great use to the world, because there was sort of a consensus that was established that it was not just one power saying we don't accept what Iraq has done, it's the world saying we don't accept what Iraq has done.
Well, and it's also, though, it goes actually back to your question about what, if anything, could have been done in this period to ensure that Russia had a more successful and complete transformation to being a member of, the sort of democratic nations of the world. And I do think the sort of, kind of empire interruptus nature of the swift collapse of the Soviet Union, the failure ever to have a full reckoning. I mean, Peter and I experienced this firsthand only a decade later as the post correspondence in Moscow in the former Soviet Union when Vladimir Putin rose to power. Essentially, that was a restoration of the sort of great state nationalism and security services rule of the late KGB without the communist idealism or rhetoric and with all of its, tactics, methods, and, sort of bastardized version of history intact. And I think that, unfortunately, this actually does come into play when you ask, well, why didn't this moment last? Not because it's our fault. We didn't lose Russia any more than, we lost China, right? But it wasn't the kind of transition that we envisioned. They saw it as a victor's peace and imposed upon them.
Yeah. And China too, it's interesting that Bush and Baker really soft pedaled what was going on in China at that time.
Yeah, look, the human rights was not their priority. I don't mean to suggest that they were indifferent to it, but to them, the most important thing with the China Tiananmen Square episode was how to maintain that relationship so it didn't blow up entirely. They put, of course, sanctions on, they cut off contacts, but that was mainly to sort of head off Congress from doing even more drastic things in their view. And Bush then had a secret emissary in Brett Scowcroft sent to Tiananmen. I think that's pragmatism as they defined it, and that's the way they saw it today. Today, Baker says that they may have made a mistake on China. That when we've asked about this more recently, he says, look, our view that China could be incorporated in the international order by bringing them into the WTO and making them part of this great globalized trading system would moderate and reform them, turns out not to have worked. And I think he's more amenable to Trump's confrontation with China, not the way he's done it, but the idea of it, than he would have been, say, 30 years ago.
Yeah, when you think about it, there was this tremendous optimism in the United States and not just in the United States, in that George H.W. Bush period. New World Order, the UN is finally working, democracy is sweeping the planet. But if a dramatist had written that scene, Russia and China are already giving the tells that this interpretation of the future is wrong, and that the drama, history still has a few more cards up its sleeve, so to speak. How much of a sense did you get from him they were aware of this possibility back then? Or were they sort of so swept up in the day-to-day that they didn't sort of wonder whether we aren't just going into a new phase of this great power competition?
You're never gonna, maybe you're a better interlocutor than we are. You're never gonna get that from Jim Baker. That's just not, he doesn't do regrets. As one of his family members said, I think very aptly, and gnawing doubts is not his thing. And I would say, the world was literally coming undone. My God, it is superhuman what they had to do just to get through this period of time. As exhausting, right, as the news cycle has been for all of us the last few years, and that's also because we have, the curse of Twitter and these other things. The truth is that in 1989 to 1982 was just literally overwhelming. So working once again on just the chapters involving, say, German unification, and you realize, like, boom, one day the government is falling in East Germany, boom, a month later it's falling again, boom, there goes Romania, boom, there goes Hungary. Oh, the Velvet Revolution that happened and now it's already over. And this was an unbelievable period of time in world history. And we all lived through it, but forgot a lot of the day to day. And, for Baker, it was just an incredible ride.
The other thing that was so astonishing really was you brought back to me that at that time in Washington, there was, there's so little sense even 6 months in advance that this huge cascade is going to happen. The discussion is still, is Gorbachev just faking it? Are they snookering us in? And these built-in assumptions, I'm afraid you ended up renewing my doubt in the wisdom of our national security bureaucracy.
Well, look, they were definitely caught behind on so many of these things. You're right about that. Just a few months before the wall fell, there's a memo in the Bush administration that says, hey, yeah, reunification of Germany is nice, but it ain't happening anytime in our lifetime, or at least not soon. It wasn't, they just had a failure of imagination. Nobody realized just how extraordinary the changes could be. And I think of one example, by the way, of why they might not have been able to sort of outline a longer term future. They were doing so many things. Like one example, for instance, we don't focus on much, is that when the Soviet Union broke up, there were 4 countries that had nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
4 countries, Belarus being one of them, Kazakhstan being another one, and Ukraine. And Baker had to basically negotiate so that we only Russia kept the nukes. That may not seem like a big deal today. It was a big deal. Imagine today if Lukashenko had nuclear weapons. That would be a frightening prospect. And so Baker's point of view, I think, was just how do we keep the world as it's falling apart together and not allow incredibly dangerous consequences to take place. Thinking through 10, 20 years down the line, I think, was probably a little too much for them.
No, I certainly agree. And I think too that, you'll often hear, well, boy, the big mistake we made was we neglected Afghanistan in those years, which is interesting. I don't remember you guys sort of looking at that at all, but that's one of the classic criticisms people make.
Yep.
And then I'm thinking, well, but if we had neglected Afghanistan, had concentrated on Afghanistan and things were fine there, but those nuclear weapons were still lying around in all those other states, everybody now would say, what idiots you were. You concentrated on Afghanistan and you ignored the Belarusian nuclear threat or whatever it might be.
Well, look, actually, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that was also happening in this sort of gray period between the transition from the Bush presidency to the Clinton presidency, in the same way that the former Yugoslavia was breaking apart into conflict. And I would say that it is a fair critique of Baker and Bush and their foreign policy that they were better, and this is, I think, does come from Baker in particular, really, really good at being essentially making a strict hierarchy of what problems he was going to focus on, seeing the unraveling of the Soviet Empire as the main event, very, very, very much focusing on that, dealing with crises as they arose, certainly in the Middle East or with the Chinese. But, remember, this was also the period that the apartheid regime in South Africa fell apart, one of the great good things in the world. But, Baker didn't focus on it. I think the things at the periphery that could become the problems in the center, and that would certainly include the Milosevic and the wars that were to come in Yugoslavia, and it would include, the Afghanistan and Pakistan and the problems there. It's not that we weren't aware of those. I think it's just that they just couldn't fight for their place in his attention with a almost monomaniacal focus on the Soviets.
Right, which makes sense for the Secretary of State. But as you say in the book, one of the criticisms people made at the time was that he didn't engage the whole building, the State Department, that American foreign policy in this time of massive overload was really being run by a small group, pretty close personally to him. And they were really good at what they did, but it meant there was no institutional capacity beyond that, maybe.
Right. Yeah, there's a certain bandwidth limit, obviously, as there might be with any team of that kind of size. And you're right, the building was nervous about him and very skeptical of him because he didn't seem to engage them in the same way that George Shultz had. George Shultz was very popular in the building. So that was sort of a lost opportunity, perhaps, to get them more fully deployed.
Well, we're coming to the end here. What's your next book?
Oh, gosh.
Well, Walter, we've made the very daunting decision that we will be living in Trump world a little bit longer than everybody else.
Okay.
We're going to do a book that, in some ways is a successor to this book, in the sense that it's a story. I think we're going to do the Trump years and how they affected Washington, and the sort of the disruption of Washington and different institutions, whether it is the State Department or how Congress was affected by having this, the Republican Party, the enemies of the people, like Peter and I. That's our thinking.
So hopefully you will not be titling it The Once and Future King.
And hopefully it won't take 7 years.
It will not. I can assure you it will not.
Well, I was going to say that would be just in time for his third term.
Right, exactly.
All right. Listen, it's been great. Thank you so much for doing this. And once COVID is over, I hope we'll get a chance to get together. And I do, again, I strongly recommend the book to all the folks out there. Thanks.
Thank you so
Walter.
much.
This
This
is
is
great.
fantastic. One of
Lot
our
of fun.
favorite. Yeah.
Great. All right.